Hi everyone, and welcome to our module on the auditory system. So let's talk about how we hear sounds in the world around us. Sounds, as you may know, travel in waves through the air, and these waves enter our ear and cause a structure called the tympanic membrane to vibrate. Behind the tympanic membrane there are three tiny bones called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and these amplify the vibration of the tympanic membrane. The smallest of the three bones, which is the stapes, pushes on a fluid-filled structure called the cochlea, and inside the cochlea there are tiny hair cells in something called the organ of Corti, and different frequencies of sound move different hair cell fibers, and this causes nerve electrical signal to get generated and go to the brain so that the brain can register the sound in the world around us. So this is a drawing of our ear, and sound waves enter here, and this structure right here is the tympanic membrane, and that's the gray thing that you see when you look in the ear of a patient with your otoscope. Behind the tympanic membrane are the three bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And the stapes is this little tiny thing right here. It's actually the smallest bone in the entire human body, which sometimes comes up as a question on Jeopardy! Behind the stapes is the cochlea and the organ of Corti, which is all in here. And then just incidentally, what you have up here is the vestibular organ, which we talk about in another module, and that's how we sense balance. Once sound waves are converted to electrical signals, those signals are carried by the cochlear nerve, which is part of cranial nerve 8. And from the inner ear, they go to the cerebellar pontine angle, which is part of the lateral pons. And you should watch for brainstem lesions with hearing loss. Many of these locate to the cerebellopontine angle in the lateral pons. From there, the signals connect with many structures, and I've listed some of them here. The superior olivary nucleus, the trapezoid body, the lateral lemniscus, the inferior colliculus, the medial geniculate body, and the transverse temporal gyri of Heschel. I think it's fairly low yield to learn all these pathways. If anything, just know that there are many structures involved and that these are some of the names. The other thing you need to know about this whole process is how it breaks down to cause hearing loss. And essentially there are two ways this process can go awry and give hearing loss. The first way is called conductive hearing loss. And that's when sound waves can't get converted to nerve signals. So if you've ever had wax in your ear, that's conductive hearing loss. There's an obstruction to the sound waves. Children who get otitis media have infection and it'll be hard to hear out of their ear. They don't have a nerve problem. They have a problem getting the sound waves to turn into nerve conduction signals. And some patients have something called otosclerosis. This is bony overgrowth of the stapes, and it's a common way some people get conductive hearing loss. The other type of hearing loss is sensorineural, and that's a problem with the nerve. So if you've got problems in the cochlea and you can't convert the sound waves into nerve signals, that's sensorineural hearing loss. If the cochlear nerve fails, for example, from a tumor like an acoustic neuroma, that's sensorineural hearing loss. And then anything that damages the cranial nerve can cause sensorineural hearing loss. So mostly what you're going to do clinically when patients present with hearing loss is try to determine whether it's conductive or sensorineural. There's one special type of hearing loss called presbycusis that you should know about it, and this is age-related hearing loss. If you have elderly parents or grandparents who wear a hearing aid, or you work in a nursing home and you see lots of the elderly people there wearing hearing aids, this is why. They get presbycusis. It's slow, steady degeneration of the organ of Corti that occurs with aging, and it results in sensorineural hearing loss, and it develops slowly over time. So just remember that this is presbycusis. It's the most common reason people need hearing aids. There are two screening tests for hearing loss that you need to know about. One's called the Weber and one's called the Rene, and in the rest of this module we're going to talk about those two tests. So the first one is the Weber test. And the way you test hearing with the Weber test is to take a vibrating tuning fork and place it on the bridge of the forehead, nose, or teeth. The way I was taught to do it was to put it on the bridge of the forehead. And you should ask the patient, do you hear the vibration of the tuning fork? And they should hear it equally in both ears if things are normal. And if you've never seen this test done, you should go to YouTube. There are lots of videos of people doing the Weber and Rene, and you can see how it's performed. Okay, so you need to know how to interpret a normal and abnormal Weber's test, so let's talk about that right now. So this is a patient who has normal hearing over here on the left side of the screen. That's why both ears are green, they're normal. And so when you place the tuning fork that's vibrating in the middle of this person's head, they will hear the signals equally in both ears. When you say, tell me which ear you hear it louder in, they will respond, I can't tell you that it's equal in both ears. And that's normal. An equal signal is going to both sides of the head. Now let's talk about a patient that has conductive hearing loss. You place the vibrating tuning fork in the middle of the head, and there's conductive hearing loss on this side. Maybe they have wax in the ear, maybe their ear is filled with fluid from otitis media. And you say to this patient, which ear do you hear it louder in? They are going to say that they hear it louder over here in the bad ear. And the reason for that is because there's no background noise in that ear that's got conductive hearing loss. So they hear everything louder over there when you put the vibrating tuning fork in the middle of the head. Now let's talk about a patient who has sensorineural hearing loss. So this ear over on this side of the head has a sensorineural problem, maybe a cranial nerve problem. When you place the tuning fork on this patient's forehead, they will hear it louder in the good ear. And the reason for that is because there's no nerve on this side of the head to pick up those vibrations. So they don't pick anything up here, and they hear it louder over on this side of the head. So a couple of key points about the Weber test. A normal test makes the tuning fork heard equally in both ears. If the patient reports they hear it louder in one ear than the other, that tells you there's a problem, but it does not tell you which type. In order to know which type, you need to know which ear is the bad ear. Now, if the patient tells you, this is my bad ear, I can't hear well out of it, then by knowing which side the sound localizes to, you can determine whether it's conductive or sensorineural. But a trick board question sometimes is to tell you that the tuning fork is heard louder in one ear and then say which type of hearing loss is it, and the answer is you cannot tell without some more information. Okay, the second hearing test that you need to be familiar with is called the Rene test. And in this test, you take a tuning fork and you start it vibrating and you place it on the mastoid bone, which is just behind the ear. And I've drawn a little diagram of what that might look like down here on the left side of the screen. And the patient will be able to hear the tuning fork vibrating. And what you're doing here is you're testing bone conduction because the vibratory waves have to go through the bones of the skull to get to the tympanic membrane. Now at some point the intensity of the tuning fork's vibration will decrease and the patient will say they can no longer hear it. At that point you move the tuning fork to just outside the ear, and I've drawn it here. You're not touching the ear or the skull, you're holding it just outside the ear, and then you ask the patient if they can still hear. When you're holding the tuning fork over here, you're now testing air conduction because the only thing the sound waves have to get through to get to the tympanic membrane is the air. So let's talk about how you interpret the results. Normally the patient can still hear when you move the tuning fork next to the ear. Keep in mind that's a tuning fork vibrating at an intensity they could not hear through bone, but you hold it next to the ear and they say, yes, I can hear that. And we say that means air conduction is greater than bone conduction. That's a normal result. And it should be obvious to you that it's easier for sound waves to move through air than it is to move through bone. Now, if the patient has a conductive hearing loss, say their ear is plugged with wax, then they will say they cannot hear it next to the ear. The fork's intensity will decrease to the point where they can't hear it through bone, and you move it to the ear and they say, no, I cannot hear that either. In that case, you say that air conduction is less than bone conduction. This is an abnormal result, and this is what you see in conductive loss. Now, in patients who have sensorineural hearing loss, they will still be able to hear the tuning fork when you move it next to the ear. And the reason is because in sensorineural loss, both air conduction and bone conduction are reduced. However, air conduction still remains greater than bone conduction. There is a way to do the Rene for sensorineural loss, but nobody does it anymore. You would have to test both the good ear and the bad ear. So in the good ear, you might get 10 seconds of bone conduction and 10 seconds of air conduction. In the bad ear, you would get 5 seconds of bone conduction and 5 seconds of air conduction. They would both be reduced, even though air conduction would remain greater than bone conduction, but people almost never do that anymore. The main purpose of the Rene test is to identify conducting hearing loss by finding people where air conduction is not greater than bone conduction. So I've summarized the findings of the Rene and Weber on this slide. So in conductive hearing loss, the Weber is louder in the bad ear, and the Rene shows that air conduction is less than bone conduction in the bad ear. In sensorineural loss, the Weber is louder in the good ear, and air conduction is greater than bone conduction in the bad ear, meaning you get a normal result from the test. And down here, I've just reminded you what you see in someone who has normal ears. Air conduction is greater than bone conduction in both ears, and the Weber goes equally to both ears. You should be aware that the Weber and the Rene are really just screening tests. When you think someone has a hearing problem, what you do is you send them for audiometry, and this is where they go into a soundproof booth and a technician administers different frequency sounds to see what they can hear, and they create something called an audiogram, which this is shown over here, showing how well they can hear different frequency sounds. And this is how you truly diagnose hearing loss. The Rene and Weber are just screening tests. Let me just finish this module by talking about two types of noise-induced hearing loss. So if you're ever exposed to an extremely loud noise, and this sometimes happens to soldiers who hear a bomb go off near them, that can rupture the tympanic membrane. So that is an abrupt, sudden loss of hearing after a very loud noise. And then, rock and roll stars who have long-term exposure to noise get damage to the ciliated hair cells in the organ of Corti, and they start to lose their hearing. And they first start to lose their high-frequency hearing. So things that are considered high-frequency are things like a bird chirping or a triangle being played, if you've ever heard a triangle in an orchestra. And then after the high-frequency sound goes, they begin to lose their low-frequency sounds. So low-frequency sounds are things like a bass drum or a tuba, and those are the last things to go. So this is what happens to people who have long-term exposure to noise. And that concludes our module on the auditory system.